Jake Harrison's weathered hand froze on the rusted door handle, his prosthetic arm trembling as Honor's massive German Shepherd frame pressed protectively against his legs. The metallic gleam of 3 gun barrels emerged from behind the towering wall of crushed automobiles in Heritage Auto Salvage. This wasn't about scrap metal anymore. The lead gunman's voice cut through the Tennessee morning air like a blade. "Step away from the dog, Harrison, and nobody gets hurt." Honor's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling from deep within his chest as Jake's mind raced. 3 months ago, he'd inherited what he thought was worthless junkyard from his deceased father. Sarah Mitchell, the neighbor's teenage daughter, screamed from her hiding spot behind the office trailer, her bike fallen and spinning its wheels uselessly in the gravel. Jake remembered his daughter Emily's laugh echoing through these same pathways just 4 years ago, before the accident that took everything from him. "Get down and stay down," Jake shouted, his Marine training overriding his fear. How had a disabled veteran and an old dog become the target of armed mercenaries? And what exactly had his father Samuel hidden in this godforsaken salvage yard? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Jake Harrison had sat in the sterile conference room of Millbrook's only law office, staring at the will that would change everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as attorney Robert Chen shuffled through the papers with practiced efficiency. Across the mahogany table, Jake's siblings wore expressions that could have frozen the Tennessee River in July. "To my son Jacob," Chen read in his monotone voice, "I leave the entirety of Heritage Auto Salvage, including all buildings, equipment, and livestock." The lawyer paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. That would be the German Shepherd, named Honor. David Harrison, impeccably dressed in his $1,000 suit, barely suppressed a snort. At 49, Jake's older brother had built a financial empire from nothing, his investment firm managing portfolios worth millions. "A junkyard and a dog," David muttered, shaking his perfectly styled head. Dad always did have a twisted sense of humor. Patricia, their sister, placed a manicured hand on David's arm. As Millbrook's most successful real estate agent, she understood property values better than anyone. "Now, David, I'm sure Dad had his reasons," but her tone suggested she thought those reasons were questionable at best. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the prosthetic arm beneath his flannel shirt suddenly feeling heavier than usual. At 47, he looked older, the kind of weathering that came from losing your right arm to an IED in Kandahar, then losing your 8-year-old daughter Emily in a car accident 3 years later. The divorce from Lisa had followed 6 months after Emily's funeral, when grief had carved out different shapes in their hearts. "There's more," Chen continued. "The dog is to remain with the property, non-negotiable terms of inheritance." That's when Honor had been led into the room. The German Shepherd was magnificent, 7 years old, 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence, with amber eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Unlike most dogs meeting strangers, Honor didn't wag his tail or seek attention. He simply observed, positioning himself beside Jake's chair with military precision. "Well, at least you won't be alone out there," Patricia said, though her voice carried the same pity Jake had grown tired of hearing. Everyone in Millbrook knew about Emily, about the accident on Highway 41 during that terrible thunderstorm. Everyone knew Jake blamed himself for letting her ride with her friend's family that night. David leaned forward, his businessman smile sliding into place. "Look, Jake, we both know you can't manage 15 acres of junk. The property taxes alone will eat you alive on disability payments. Why don't you let Patricia and me handle the sale? We'll split everything 3 ways, fair and square." Jake looked down at Honor, who was watching him with an intensity that seemed almost human. The dog's ears were alert, his head tilted slightly as if he understood every word being spoken. For reasons Jake couldn't explain, he felt like this animal was waiting for something, some decision that would determine both their futures. "I'll think about it," Jake said finally, though something in Honor's steady gaze suggested thinking might not be enough. The drive from Millbrook's downtown to Heritage Auto Salvage took exactly 12 minutes, but it felt like a journey to another planet. Jake's battered Ford pickup coughed and wheezed up the winding mountain road, past weathered barns and trailer homes that had seen better decades. Honor sat in the passenger seat like a furry co-pilot, his amber eyes fixed on the road ahead with an alertness that made Jake wonder what the dog was seeing that he wasn't. The salvage yard sprawled across 15 acres of rolling Tennessee hillside, a graveyard of American automotive dreams. Stacked cars rose like metallic mountains against the backdrop of the Appalachian foothills, their rust-streaked bodies telling stories of Sunday drives and family vacations that had ended decades ago. The main office was a single-wide trailer that had seen its share of storms, its white aluminum siding now more gray than anything else. Jake parked beside the trailer and killed the engine. The silence that followed was profound. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. He'd grown up in cities, lived in apartments, spent his military years in bases surrounded by thousands of other soldiers. This isolation felt overwhelming. "Well, boy," Jake said to Honor, "I guess this is home now." Honor didn't respond with the typical dog enthusiasm. Instead, he jumped down from the truck with purposeful grace and began what could only be described as a patrol. The dog moved with military precision, nose to the ground, checking the perimeter of the office trailer, the main garage, and the towering stacks of vehicles. His behavior was methodical, professional, nothing like any pet dog Jake had ever seen. The first sign that something was unusual came when Honor reached the area behind the main garage. The dog stopped abruptly, his entire body going rigid. His hackles rose slightly, and a low whine emerged from his throat, not fear, but frustration, as if he'd encountered a puzzle he couldn't solve. Jake approached cautiously, his prosthetic arm making it awkward to navigate the uneven ground. "What is it, Honor? Find something interesting?" Honor began to paw at a specific spot in the hard-packed earth, his claws scratching insistently at what looked like ordinary dirt. The behavior was compulsive, focused, and completely unlike normal dog curiosity. When Jake tried to call him away, Honor ignored him completely, something no well-trained military dog would do without good reason. That evening, as Jake settled into the trailer that would serve as his new home, he couldn't shake the image of Honor's strange behavior. The dog had eventually stopped scratching, but only when darkness fell. Now he lay by the trailer's front door, not relaxed, but alert, as if standing guard. The trailer's interior was a time capsule of his father's solitary life. Samuel Harrison had been a man of few possessions but meticulous habits. Everything was clean, organized, and functional. The refrigerator held basics: milk, eggs, sandwich meat. The cabinets contained simple meals and a half-empty bottle of bourbon that Jake stared at for a long moment before closing the door. On the kitchen table, Jake found a manila envelope with his name written in his father's careful handwriting. Inside was a simple note. "Jake, Honor knows things I never taught him. Trust the dog. Trust yourself. The real inheritance isn't what you can see. Dad." Jake read the note 3 times, each reading deepening his confusion. His father had never been one for riddles or mysterious messages. Samuel Harrison had been a straightforward man who fixed cars and minded his own business. The idea that he'd leave cryptic instructions was completely out of character. A scratching sound at the door interrupted his thoughts. Honor was pawing at the entrance, whining softly. When Jake opened the door, the dog immediately trotted toward the garage area, looking back expectantly. Despite his exhaustion, Jake grabbed a flashlight and followed. Under the beam of his flashlight, the spot Honor had been obsessing over looked different. The earth was definitely disturbed, and there seemed to be a slight depression, as if something large had been buried and the ground had settled over time. Jake knelt down, running his hand over the surface. The soil felt different here, looser, more recently worked than the hard-packed clay surrounding it. Honor sat beside him, perfectly still, watching Jake's every movement. In the darkness, with only the flashlight creating a small circle of illumination, Jake felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. 3 months ago, his biggest worry had been making rent on his one-bedroom apartment in Nashville. Now he was alone on a mountain with a mysterious dog and a growing certainty that his father had left him more than just a salvage yard. The smart thing would be to wait until morning, to approach this mystery in daylight with proper tools. But as Jake looked at Honor's expectant expression, he realized the dog wasn't going to let this wait until morning. Whatever was buried here, Honor considered it urgent. And despite everything, his confusion, his exhaustion, his growing unease, Jake found himself trusting the dog's judgment. The next morning brought clarity that the previous night's flashlight beam couldn't provide. Jake stood in the garage, examining the collection of tools his father had left behind. Everything from basic wrenches to sophisticated diagnostic equipment. Among them, he found exactly what he needed, a metal detector that looked both expensive and well-maintained. Honor watched from the garage entrance as Jake carried the device to the mysterious patch of earth. The dog's posture remained alert, his tail held low but steady, a sign Jake was beginning to recognize as focused anticipation rather than anxiety. The metal detector's initial sweep produced nothing but the usual detritus of a working salvage yard: bottle caps, nails, fragments of automotive parts. But when Jake moved over the spot Honor had marked, the device erupted in a symphony of beeps and electronic squeals. Whatever was down there was large, metallic, and buried deliberately. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Jake muttered, unconsciously echoing one of his father's favorite expressions. The reading suggested something roughly the size of a footlocker, buried about 3 feet down. It took Jake 2 hours to excavate the object, working carefully with a shovel while Honor supervised from a position that gave him clear sight lines to both the road and the surrounding property. The dog's military bearing was becoming more apparent by the hour. He wasn't just watching Jake work, he was providing security. The object Jake unearthed was indeed a military-style footlocker, olive drab and built to withstand anything short of a direct artillery hit. Despite being buried for what must have been years, it showed no signs of rust or deterioration. A heavy-duty combination lock secured the lid, its tumblers still smooth and functional. Jake sat back on his heels, studying the lock. His father had been a methodical man with predictable habits. The combination would be something meaningful, but not obvious, not a birthday or anniversary that someone could guess. Jake tried several possibilities: his mother's birthday, his father's enlistment date, the day Jake had shipped out to Afghanistan. Nothing worked. Honor, who had been lying patiently nearby, suddenly stood and walked to Jake's side. The dog looked at the lock, then up at Jake, and gave a single, soft bark. When Jake didn't respond, Honor repeated the action. "Lock, Jake. Bark." "You know something about this, don't you, boy?" Jake asked. Honor's amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. "I wish you could talk." That's when Jake remembered the manila envelope from the night before. He pulled his father's note from his pocket and read it again. "Honor knows things I never taught him." What if his father had been more literal than cryptic? Jake looked at Honor, really looked at him. The dog was 7 years old, which meant he'd been around during Jake's military service. What if the combination wasn't about family dates, but about Honor himself? "When's your birthday, boy?" Jake asked, feeling slightly foolish for talking to a dog about lock combinations. But Honor's ears perked up, and his tail gave a single wag. Jake tried Honor's approximate age, 7 years back from the current date. The lock remained stubbornly closed. Then he tried different variations, working backward through possibilities until he hit on 0811, August 11th, the date on Honor's military service tags that Jake had noticed hanging from his collar. The lock clicked open. Inside the footlocker, Jake found items that transformed his understanding of both his father and his inheritance. The contents were organized with military precision. Thick manila folders containing documents, photographs, and what appeared to be technical specifications. At the bottom of the locker was an ornate brass key unlike anything Jake had ever seen, its head shaped like a complex geometric pattern. The photographs told a story Jake had never suspected. His father, Samuel Harrison, appeared in images alongside men in military uniforms and business suits, standing in front of facilities that looked nothing like auto salvage yards. The documents were more puzzling. Technical specifications for equipment Jake didn't recognize, shipping manifests for items with cryptic code names, and financial records showing transactions in amounts that made Jake's head spin. One folder was labeled Project Heritage in his father's careful handwriting. Inside, Jake found a letter addressed to him, dated just 6 months before Samuel's death. "Son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Honor has done his job and led you to the truth. Everything you think you know about Heritage Auto Salvage is a cover story. Everything you think you know about me is incomplete. I have spent the last 30 years of my life protecting something that could change the world or destroy it, depending on whose hands it falls into." Jake's hands trembled as he continued reading. His father explained that Heritage Auto Salvage was a front operation, established during the Cold War as a secure storage and monitoring facility for sensitive military equipment. The salvage yard's remote location and innocuous appearance made it perfect for hiding assets that various government agencies needed to keep off official records. "The brass key in this footlocker opens a facility beneath the main garage," Samuel's letter continued. "Honor has been trained to protect that facility and its contents. He's not just a retired military dog, Jake. He's been my partner in the most important mission of my life. Now he's yours." The letter went on to explain that the junk in the salvage yard included millions of dollars worth of decommissioned military equipment, rare metals, and classified prototypes that various agencies had stored there over the decades. The total value of the real inheritance was approximately $200 million. "Your siblings suspect something," the letter warned. "David has been asking questions about the business for years, and Patricia has been unusually interested in the property values. They know there's more here than meets the eye, but they don't know what or where. Honor will help you decide who to trust." Jake looked up from the letter to find Honor watching him intently. The dog's expression seemed to say, "Now you understand." The weight of responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about inheriting property anymore. It was about protecting something his father had guarded for 3 decades. It was about proving worthy of a trust he'd never asked for and a partner he was only beginning to understand. Honor stood up and walked toward the main garage, looking back at Jake expectantly. It was time to see what the brass key would unlock. The brass key felt warm in Jake's palm as he followed Honor toward the main garage, a structure he'd barely glanced at during his first day at the salvage yard. What he'd dismissed as another weathered-out building now commanded his full attention. Honor moved with purpose, leading Jake to what appeared to be an ordinary electrical panel mounted on the garage's interior wall. The panel looked decades old, its metal surface painted institutional gray and marked with faded warning labels about high voltage. But when Jake examined it more closely, he noticed something peculiar. One of the bolt heads wasn't a bolt at all. It was a hexagonal recess that perfectly matched the geometric pattern of his father's brass key. Jake inserted the key and turned it. The click was so subtle he almost missed it, followed by a soft hiss of hydraulics that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A section of the concrete floor, nearly invisible until it moved, slid aside to reveal a staircase descending into darkness. Honor descended first, his paws silent on the metal steps. Jake followed, his flashlight beam revealing a tunnel that extended far beyond what should have been possible under a simple garage. The air was cool and dry, artificially maintained at a constant temperature and humidity. This wasn't some amateur hiding place. It was a professionally constructed facility. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that took Jake's breath away. The space was easily the size of an aircraft hangar, its concrete walls lined with climate-controlled storage units, workbenches equipped with sophisticated tools, and computer terminals that hummed with quiet efficiency. Emergency lighting had activated when they entered, casting everything in a sterile white glow. Along one wall, military vehicles sat under protective covers. Jeeps, trucks, and equipment trailers that looked like they'd been driven off the factory floor yesterday. Another section housed rows of metal containers, each labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Jake, but everything to someone with the right clearance. Honor led him to a central console where multiple monitors displayed security feeds from cameras Jake hadn't noticed around the property. The dog sat beside a chair that was clearly designed for long periods of observation, its ergonomic design suggesting whoever used it spent considerable time monitoring the facility. A manila envelope sat on the console, marked Eyes Only, J. Harrison. Inside, Jake found a comprehensive manual that read like something from a spy novel. His father's facility served as a secure storage and distribution point for dark military assets, equipment that officially didn't exist but was too valuable to destroy. Weapons prototypes, experimental vehicles, rare metals used in classified projects, and communication equipment that various agencies needed to keep off their official inventories. The financial implications were staggering. Jake's inheritance wasn't just a salvage yard, it was a carefully curated collection of military hardware worth nearly $200 million. The manual included detailed inventories, authentication certificates, and contact information for buyers who operated in the gray areas between government agencies and private military contractors. But with the fortune came responsibility that made Jake's head spin. His father's operation had been more than storage. It was a carefully balanced network of information and favors that kept dangerous weapons out of the wrong hands while ensuring legitimate operations had access to equipment they needed. Samuel Harrison hadn't just been a caretaker. He'd been a gatekeeper with the power to influence conflicts around the world. Honor's sudden tension broke Jake's concentration. The dog's ears had snapped to attention, his body rigid with alertness. On the security monitors, Jake saw what had triggered the response. A black sedan was pulling up to the salvage yard's main gate, followed by a second vehicle that stayed back on the road. Jake recognized the sedan's occupants immediately. David and Patricia, accompanied by two men in business suits who definitely weren't from Millbrook. The visitors moved with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to getting what they wanted, regardless of obstacles. "Showtime," Jake muttered, securing the facility and following Honor back up to ground level. By the time they emerged from the garage, David was already examining the excavation site where Jake had found the footlocker. "Well, well," David said, his voice carrying the particular smugness Jake remembered from childhood. "Looks like little brother's been doing some treasure hunting." Patricia stood beside their rental car, her designer heels completely inappropriate for salvage yard terrain. "Jake, honey, we need to talk. These gentlemen have some very interesting questions about Dad's business activities." The two strangers stepped forward with the confident bearing of men who were used to intimidating people. The taller one, a silver-haired man in his 50s, extended his hand. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Thomas Kellerman, representing certain government interests. We understand your father may have left behind materials that belong to the American people." Jake didn't shake the offered hand. Honor positioned himself between Jake and the visitors, his amber eyes fixed on Kellerman with unmistakable hostility. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jake said carefully. Kellerman's smile was predatory. "Your father operated under several contracts that technically made him a custodian rather than an owner of certain materials. Now that he's deceased, those materials need to be returned to proper channels." "What kind of materials?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew. David stepped closer, his expression mixing concern with calculation. "Jake, these people have been very patient, but they're running out of time. There are international buyers interested in some of Dad's inventory. If we don't cooperate, they might take less diplomatic approaches." The threat was clear, even wrapped in David's smooth delivery. Jake felt his military training engage, his awareness expanding to catalog potential threats and escape routes. Honor's posture suggested the dog was making similar calculations. "I'd like to see some identification," Jake said. "And I'd like to understand exactly what authority you claim over my property." Kellerman's patience was wearing thin. "Mr. Harrison, we're trying to handle this quietly for everyone's benefit. But if you prefer, we can involve federal marshals, tax investigators, and various other agencies that might take a very close look at your family's activities." Patricia stepped forward, her voice taking on the soothing tone she used with difficult real estate clients. "Jake, sweetie, we know this is overwhelming. Dad left you with a lot of responsibility, and frankly, we're worried about you handling it alone. Maybe it would be better if David and I helped manage things until you're more settled." The suggestion hit Jake like a physical blow. His siblings were trying to have him declared incompetent, just as David had threatened during the will reading. They wanted control of the inheritance, and they were willing to use his disability and PTSD against him to get it. Honor's growl was barely audible, but the message was clear. The dog had positioned himself to protect Jake, and his military training was showing. This wasn't a pet defending his owner, this was a trained guardian assessing threats and preparing to neutralize them. "I think you should leave," Jake said quietly. "All of you." Kellerman's friendly facade finally cracked. "Mr. Harrison, you're making a serious mistake. The materials your father stored here aren't toys. In the wrong hands, they could cause considerable damage. We're offering you a chance to do the right thing. And if I refuse? Then we'll be forced to take alternative measures," Kellerman replied. "Your father understood the delicate nature of these arrangements. I hope you're equally reasonable." David moved closer, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he used for family conversations. "Jake, listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. The PTSD, the drinking, losing Emily, it's affected your judgment. Let us help you make the smart choice here." The reference to his daughter sent a surge of rage through Jake that took all his self-control to contain. Honor sensed the emotional shift and stepped closer, his presence both protective and grounding. "Get off my property," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned as a Marine sergeant. "Now!" Kellerman and David exchanged a look that spoke of backup plans and escalation protocols. Patricia seemed genuinely concerned, but her worry was overshadowed by fear of losing access to whatever fortune she thought the salvage yard contained. "This isn't over," Kellerman warned, as the group retreated toward their vehicles. "You have 48 hours to reconsider. After that, we'll assume you're not acting in good faith." As the cars disappeared down the mountain road, Jake felt the weight of his situation settling around him like a closing trap. He had 48 hours to figure out how to protect a $200 million secret from his own family, government agents who might or might not be legitimate, and international buyers who definitely weren't. Honor pressed against his leg, offering the kind of solid comfort that only came from absolute loyalty. The dog's amber eyes held a message Jake was finally beginning to understand. They were in this together, whatever came next. The real battle for Heritage Auto Salvage was just beginning. The 48-hour countdown began with deceptive calm. Jake spent the first 12 hours studying his father's manuals, trying to understand the scope of what he'd inherited. The underground facility contained enough firepower to outfit a small army, but more importantly, it held the kind of specialized equipment that various government agencies used for operations they couldn't officially acknowledge. Honor remained constantly alert, patrolling the property with military precision. The dog's behavior had shifted from protective to tactical. He was no longer just guarding Jake. He was defending a strategic position. Every few hours, Honor would return to Jake's side and give a specific series of barks that Jake was beginning to recognize as an all-clear signal. On the second day, things started to go wrong. The first sign of trouble came when Jake tried to call his lawyer, only to discover his phone had no signal. A quick check revealed that someone had destroyed the cell tower servicing the mountain area, not damaged by weather or accident, but deliberately sabotaged. The landline in the trailer had been cut sometime during the night. Honor's agitation increased as the day progressed. The dog refused to eat, spending his time moving between observation posts he'd established around the property. His behavior reminded Jake of bomb-sniffing dogs he'd worked with in Afghanistan, animals who knew danger was close, but couldn't communicate the specifics to their human partners. By evening, surveillance had become obvious. Jake spotted at least 3 different vehicles that took turns parking at various points along the mountain roads with clear sight lines to the salvage yard. The occupants made no effort to hide their presence. They wanted Jake to know he was being watched. The psychological pressure was deliberate and effective. Jake found himself jumping at every sound, second-guessing every decision. His PTSD symptoms, which had been manageable for months, returned with a vengeance. The hypervigilance, the constant scanning for threats, the inability to relax, it all came flooding back as if he'd never left the combat zone. Honor seemed to sense Jake's deteriorating mental state. The dog began staying closer, his presence a constant reminder that Jake wasn't alone in this fight. When Jake's hands started shaking, a stress response that had plagued him since losing his arm, Honor would press his massive head against Jake's leg, providing both physical and emotional grounding. The breaking point came on the morning of the 3rd day. Jake woke to find Honor standing rigidly at the trailer window, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling from his chest. Outside, the surveillance had escalated. Men in tactical gear were positioned at various points around the property perimeter, making no effort to conceal their presence. Jake's military training kicked in as he assessed the situation. These weren't government agents following protocol. They were private contractors conducting what looked like preparation for an assault. The 48-hour deadline hadn't expired, but someone had decided to accelerate the timeline. The satellite phone in his father's emergency kit finally connected him with the outside world. Jake's call reached Agent Sarah Mitchell, the CIA handler his father's notes had identified as the primary government contact for the facility. "Agent Mitchell," Jake said when the call connected. "This is Jake Harrison. I think I need help." The woman's voice was crisp and professional. "Mr. Harrison, we've been monitoring the situation. Your property is currently under surveillance by a private military contractor called Titan Security. They're not working for any legitimate government agency." "Then who hired them?" "We believe your brother David has connections to international arms dealers who are very interested in your father's inventory. The man who introduced himself as Thomas Kellerman is actually Marcus Kane, a former CIA operative who now works for whoever pays the highest price." Jake felt the pieces clicking into place. David's financial firm hadn't been struggling. It had been serving as a front for illegal arms trafficking. His brother had known about their father's operation and had been positioning himself to take control the moment Samuel died. "What are my options?" Jake asked. "Right now, you need to secure the facility and prepare for extraction. We have a team en route, but they're still 6 hours away. Can you hold out that long?" Jake looked at Honor, who was still watching the tactical team through the window. The dog's posture suggested he understood the stakes. This wasn't just surveillance anymore, it was preparation for an assault. "I'll have to," Jake said. The attack began 2 hours later with a precision that spoke of military planning. The assault team moved in 3 groups, approaching from different directions to prevent escape routes. Their mistake was underestimating both Jake's military experience and Honor's specialized training. Jake had spent the waiting time preparing the facility for siege conditions. The underground chamber had backup power, independent air circulation, and enough supplies to last for days. More importantly, it had security systems his father had installed but never explained, systems that Honor seemed to understand instinctively. When the first breach team reached the main garage, Honor was ready. The dog had positioned himself to attack from an unexpected angle, using the maze of salvaged cars as cover. His assault was swift and surgical. He disabled the point man with a precision takedown that would have made his military trainers proud, then disappeared back into the vehicle maze before the rest of the team could respond. Jake used the distraction to activate the facility's lockdown protocols. Steel barriers slammed down over the hidden entrance, sealing the underground chamber. Emergency lighting bathed the salvage yard in an eerie red glow, and automated systems began broadcasting warnings that federal agents were en route. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical defenses. Jake's father had understood that the facility's greatest protection wasn't its weapons, but its official government connections. The automated warnings, combined with the obvious sophistication of the security systems, would make any legitimate contractor think twice about proceeding. But Kane's team weren't legitimate contractors. They were mercenaries with nothing to lose. The siege stretched through the afternoon as Jake and Honor played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the assault team. The dog's intelligence and training gave them a significant advantage. Honor could move through the salvage yard invisibly, gathering intelligence and striking at opportune moments. Jake found himself relying on skills he'd hoped never to use again. The combat instincts, the tactical thinking, the ability to remain calm under fire. It all came back as if he'd never left the battlefield. His prosthetic arm, which had seemed like such a limitation, actually became an advantage in close-quarters combat. Opponents expecting a two-handed fighter found themselves facing unexpected angles of attack. As the sun began to set, the tactical situation changed dramatically. Honor's reconnaissance revealed that Kane had called in reinforcements. A second team was moving up the mountain road with heavy equipment. Whatever they'd brought, it was designed to breach the facility's defenses. Jake realized they were running out of time and options. The underground chamber was secure, but it was also a trap. If Kane's team managed to seal the entrance, Jake and Honor would be buried alive with their $200 million secret. The decision to break out came when Jake heard the distinctive whine of drilling equipment from above. Kane's team was attempting to breach the facility through the concrete floor of the garage. They had the right equipment and the technical knowledge. Someone had provided them with detailed plans of his father's installation. Honor's amber eyes met Jake's in the emergency lighting of the underground chamber. The dog's expression was clear. They needed to fight their way out, and they needed to do it now. Jake gathered the most sensitive documents from his father's files, secured them in a waterproof case, and prepared for what felt like a suicide mission. They would emerge from the facility directly into the middle of a heavily armed assault team, with no backup and minimal weapons. But as Jake looked at Honor, 90 pounds of loyal, intelligent, absolutely fearless German Shepherd. He realized they had one advantage Kane's team couldn't match. They were fighting for something bigger than money or politics. They were fighting for family, for trust, and for a bond that had been forged in loyalty and tested in fire. The counterattack began when Jake opened the facility's emergency exit, a concealed passage that emerged behind the main office trailer. Honor led the way, his military training taking over as he became not just a companion, but a weapon guided by absolute devotion. The battle for Heritage Auto Salvage was about to reach its climax. The emergency exit opened into chaos. Jake emerged behind the office trailer to find Kane's assault team had transformed the salvage yard into a combat zone. Floodlights blazed from multiple positions, turning night into harsh artificial day. The drilling equipment had punched through the garage floor, and Jake could hear men shouting orders as they prepared to breach the underground facility. Honor moved like a shadow beside him, the dog's military training evident in every calculated step. They had perhaps minutes before Kane's team discovered the facility was empty and began searching for alternative escape routes. Jake's plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. They needed to reach his truck and escape down the mountain road before the reinforcements could establish a perimeter. The first obstacle was a two-man team positioned between them and the parking area. Jake watched from behind a stack of rusted car bodies as the mercenaries maintained their position with professional discipline. These weren't amateurs, they moved and communicated like military veterans, which meant they would be dangerous opponents in any direct confrontation. Honor seemed to read Jake's thoughts. The dog slipped away into the maze of salvaged vehicles, becoming invisible among the shadows and metal. Jake counted to 30, then began his own movement, using the prosthetic arm's reduced noise signature to his advantage as he crawled between the car stacks. The attack came from Honor's direction, a sudden violent encounter that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Jake heard surprised shouts, the distinctive sound of equipment hitting the ground, and then silence. When he reached the position, he found both mercenaries unconscious but breathing, their weapons and communications equipment scattered. Honor appeared beside him, panting slightly, but uninjured. The dog's amber eyes held a fierce satisfaction. This was what he'd been trained for, and he was good at it. They made it halfway to the truck before everything went wrong. Kane himself appeared from behind the office trailer, flanked by 3 armed men. The former CIA operative's face was a mask of cold professionalism as he raised his weapon toward Jake. "That's far enough, Harrison. Call off your dog, and we can discuss this like civilized people." Jake's combat instincts screamed danger, but he was caught in the open with no cover. His hand moved toward the pistol he'd taken from his father's emergency supplies, knowing he'd never draw fast enough to matter. Honor made the choice for him. The German Shepherd's attack was a thing of beauty and terror. 90 pounds of muscle and loyalty launched through the air with mathematical precision. Kane's weapon was turning toward the dog when Honor struck, his jaws locking onto the man's gun arm with crushing force. The impact sent both Kane and Honor rolling across the gravel. Jake heard the distinctive crack of breaking bone as the dog's bite found its mark, followed immediately by the sharper crack of gunfire. One of Kane's men had a clear shot and took it. Honor's yelp of pain cut through Jake like a blade. The dog released Kane and tried to stand, but his left rear leg wouldn't support his weight. Blood was spreading across his gray and white coat, dark and terrible in the harsh floodlight glare. "Honor!" Jake's shout was raw with anguish as he dropped beside his wounded partner. The bullet had caught the dog in the hip, and Jake could see immediately that the injury was serious. Honor's breathing was shallow, rapid, signs of shock and blood loss that Jake recognized from too many battlefield injuries. Kane struggled to his feet, cradling his mangled arm. His face was pale with pain and fury as he gestured to his remaining men. "Kill them both." Make it look like they resisted federal agents. Honor tried to lift his head, tried to position himself between Jake and the threat, but his strength was fading fast. The dog's amber eyes met Jake's with an expression that seemed to say everything that mattered: trust, loyalty, and an acceptance of whatever came next. Jake felt something break inside his chest, a snapping sensation that had nothing to do with physical injury and everything to do with the realization that he was about to lose the only family he had left. First Emily, now Honor. Everyone he loved died because of other people's greed and violence. The rage that followed was pure and terrible. Jake had spent years in therapy learning to control his anger, to channel his warrior instincts into productive outlets. But watching Honor bleeding in the gravel while men prepared to murder them both for money stripped away every civilized restraint he'd built. Kane's men never saw him coming. Jake's assault was fueled by grief and fury, his military training combining with desperate love to create something unstoppable. He moved through the mercenaries like a force of nature, his prosthetic arm becoming a weapon as effective as any blade. The men were professionals, but they weren't prepared for someone who had literally nothing left to lose. When the violence ended, Jake knelt beside Honor in the sudden silence. The dog's breathing was growing weaker, his life flowing out onto the Tennessee gravel. In the distance, Jake could hear vehicles approaching. Agent Mitchell's rescue team was finally arriving. But for Honor, help was coming too late. The veterinary clinic in Millbrook had never handled a case like Honor's. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, who usually treated farm animals and household pets, found herself performing emergency surgery on a military working dog whose medical records read like classified documents. Jake sat in the waiting room's harsh fluorescent lighting, his hands still stained with Honor's blood, watching the clock tick past midnight. Agent Mitchell had arrived with a full tactical team, just as Jake was loading Honor into his truck. The sight of Kane's mercenaries scattered across the salvage yard had told the story without need for explanation. "We'll handle the cleanup," she'd assured Jake. "You get that dog to a doctor." Now Jake waited, replaying every moment of the fight and wondering if he could have done something different. The guilt was familiar, the same crushing weight he'd carried since Emily's accident, the same questions that had no good answers. Everyone he loved paid the price for his choices. Dr. Carter emerged from the operating room at 3 a.m., her surgical scrubs stained and her face exhausted. "He's alive," she said without preamble, and Jake felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. "But it's going to be touch and go for the next few days." "What kind of touch and go?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "The bullet fractured his hip and caused significant internal bleeding. I've repaired what I can, but there's nerve damage. Even if he recovers fully, he may never walk normally again." Dr. Carter's expression was grim. German shepherds are tough, but this injury would end most dogs' working careers. Jake thought about Honor's military bearing, his purposeful stride, the way he'd patrolled the salvage yard with absolute confidence. The idea of that proud animal reduced to limping dependency felt like another death. "Can I see him, Doctor?" Carter led Jake to a recovery room where Honor lay motionless on a padded table, surrounded by monitoring equipment that beeped softly in the quiet darkness. A4 lines ran into the dog's front leg, and his rear quarters were wrapped in bandages that looked disturbingly small against his normally powerful frame. Jake pulled a chair beside the table and placed his hand gently on Honor's head. The dog's fur was soft and warm, but his breathing remained shallow and labored. "I'm sorry, boy," Jake whispered. "This is all my fault." Honor's eyes opened slowly, unfocused but aware. The dog's gaze found Jake's face, and his tail gave the faintest twitch, barely a movement, but unmistakably intentional. Even injured and sedated, Honor was trying to comfort him. Jake stayed through the night, dozing fitfully in the uncomfortable chair while Honor fought for his life. Every change in the dog's breathing sent Jake's heart racing, every beep from the monitors a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. Dawn brought David and Patricia to the clinic, their faces showing a mixture of shock and barely concealed anger. Jake met them in the parking lot, unwilling to bring their drama into Honor's recovery space. "Jesus Christ, Jake," David said, his usual composure cracked. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The FBI has seized all of Dad's records. They're treating this like a federal crime scene." Patricia was crying, her makeup streaked and her designer clothes wrinkled from a sleepless night. "They're saying we're under investigation for arms trafficking. My real estate license could be revoked. David's firm is frozen pending review." Jake looked at his siblings and felt nothing but exhaustion. "You brought this on yourselves. You hired those mercenaries. You put everyone in danger because you couldn't stand the thought of me inheriting something valuable." "We didn't know they were going to attack you," Patricia protested. "We just wanted to understand what Dad was hiding. We had a right to know." "Did you have a right to try and have me declared incompetent?" Jake's voice was quiet, but his anger was building. "Did you have a right to sell information about Dad's operation to international arms dealers?" David's face went pale. "How did you—" "Agent Mitchell briefed me. Your financial firm has been laundering money for weapons traffickers for 2 years. You've been waiting for Dad to die so you could get access to his inventory." Jake stepped closer to his brother. "How many people died because of weapons you helped finance, David? How many Emilys?" The reference to Jake's daughter hit its mark. David flinched as if Jake had struck him physically. "That's not fair." "That accident had nothing to do with—" "Everything's connected," Jake said. "The greed, the violence, the willingness to hurt family for money, it's all the same poison, and you've been drinking it so long you can't taste it anymore." Agent Mitchell arrived as the confrontation was escalating. She approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "Mr. Harrison, we need to discuss your family's situation." Jake turned to face her, leaving his siblings standing in uncomfortable silence. "Are they under arrest?" "That depends on their level of cooperation," Mitchell replied diplomatically. "Your brother's financial records show payments from organizations we've been tracking for years. Your sister provided property assessments and floor plans to Kane's people. But intent matters in federal court." Patricia stepped forward, her voice shaking. "I didn't know what they were planning." "David said they just needed to understand the property's value for estate planning. I never thought anyone would get hurt." "But you did think Jake wasn't competent to handle the inheritance," Mitchell observed. "You were preparing legal documents to have him declared mentally incompetent due to his PTSD." David's silence was telling. Jake realized his brother had been playing a much longer game than anyone suspected. The pressure to sell, the questions about mental competency, the introduction of Kane as a government representative, it had all been orchestrated to separate Jake from his inheritance. "There's something else you should know," Mitchell continued, her voice gentle but firm. "We've traced the components used in the IED that killed your unit in Afghanistan, Jake. The rare earth metals came through a supply chain your brother's firm helped finance." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He staggered backward, his prosthetic arm suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. David's greed hadn't just threatened Jake's inheritance. It had contributed to the bombing that killed his fellow Marines and cost Jake his arm. "That's not possible," David whispered, but his face had gone ashen. "Money's fungible," Mitchell explained. "You thought you were just moving numbers around for wealthy clients. But those clients were using your services to fund terrorist operations. The metals that ended up in that roadside bomb were purchased with money you helped launder." Jake felt the world tilting around him. Emily's death, his own injuries, the friends he'd lost in Afghanistan, all of it connected to his brother's pursuit of easy money. The family he'd spent his life trying to please had been profiting from the violence that destroyed him. Honor's weak whine from inside the clinic cut through Jake's spiral of rage and grief. The dog was awake and looking for him, needing the comfort of his presence during recovery. Jake realized he had a choice to make. He could let the poison of his family's betrayal consume him, or he could focus on what mattered: Honor's recovery and the future they could build together. "I need to get back to my dog," Jake said quietly. "Honor's the only family I have left." Patricia stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Jake, please. We're still family. We made mistakes. But we can fix this." Jake looked at his sister, seeing for the first time how the pursuit of money and status had hollowed her out. She wasn't evil, just weak, and weakness in the wrong circumstances could be just as destructive as malice. "No," Jake said simply. "Family shows up when things get hard. Family protects each other. You two showed up to take what you thought was yours and left when Honor and I needed you most." He walked back into the clinic, leaving his siblings in the parking lot with Agent Mitchell and the weight of their choices. Inside, Honor was awake and alert, his amber eyes tracking Jake's movement as he returned to the chair beside the recovery table. "Hey, boy," Jake said softly, stroking the dog's head. "How are you feeling?" Honor's tail managed a weak wag, and his nose nudged Jake's hand. The message was clear. As long as they were together, everything would be okay. For the first time in years, Jake believed it might be true. 6 months after the attack on Heritage Auto Salvage, Jake stood in the morning sunshine watching Honor work with a young veteran named Maria Santos. The German Shepherd moved slowly but deliberately, his slight limp barely noticeable as he demonstrated the proper way to provide mobility support for someone with a prosthetic leg. Maria, who had lost her left leg to an IED in Syria, followed Honor's patient guidance with growing confidence. "He knows exactly what I need before I do," Maria said, her voice filled with wonder as Honor positioned himself to provide balanced support during a difficult maneuver. "How does he understand so much?" Jake smiled, remembering asking himself the same question months ago. "Honor's got a gift for reading people. He spent years learning to anticipate what soldiers need." The Harrison Military Dog Training Foundation had grown from an idea born in grief to a thriving operation that paired rescued dogs with disabled veterans across the Southeast. The underground facility beneath the salvage yard had been converted into a state-of-the-art training center, its climate-controlled environment perfect for year-round operations. The weapons and equipment Jake had inherited had been sold through official government channels, providing the foundation with an endowment that would last for generations. Dr. Carter approached from the newly constructed veterinary clinic that served as the foundation's medical facility. "Honor's quarterly checkup shows continued improvement," she reported. "The nerve regeneration is remarkable for a dog his age. He may never be military-grade again, but he's found a new mission." Jake watched Honor gently correct Maria's posture, the dog's amber eyes bright with purpose. The injury that had nearly killed him had indeed ended his career as a tactical asset, but it had revealed something even more valuable: an intuitive understanding of human vulnerability and the patience to help heal it. "He's teaching me as much as he's teaching the veterans," Jake admitted. "I thought losing his mobility would break his spirit, but he's adapted better than I have." The foundation had attracted attention from across the country. Veterans organizations, medical facilities, and government agencies had all sent representatives to study the Harrison method of pairing dogs with disabled soldiers. What made their program unique wasn't just the quality of the animals, many of whom were rescues from shelters, but the understanding that both dog and human were often healing from trauma. Agent Mitchell visited monthly, ostensibly to check on security, but really to see how Jake and Honor were adapting to civilian life. "You've built something remarkable here," she said, joining them on the observation deck overlooking the training area. Your father would be proud. Jake's relationship with Samuel Harrison's memory had evolved over the months. Learning about his father's secret life had been painful, but understanding the sacrifice and dedication it had required had given Jake a new perspective on the man who had seemed so distant during his childhood. Dad spent 30 years protecting things that could hurt people, Jake reflected. Now we're using those resources to help people heal. It feels like the right kind of legacy. The Foundation's success had also brought unexpected reconciliation. Patricia had been visiting weekly since completing her cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. Her real estate expertise had proven invaluable in helping the Foundation acquire additional properties for expansion, and her genuine remorse had slowly rebuilt trust with Jake. "I know I can't undo what I did," Patricia had said during one of their difficult conversations, "but maybe I can help you build something better from the pieces." David's fate had been different. His involvement with international arms trafficking had been too deep and too deliberate for cooperation agreements. He was serving a 15-year federal sentence, his financial empire dismantled and his assets seized to compensate victims of the weapons he had helped finance. Jake had visited him once in prison, not to forgive, but to find closure. "I was angry about Dad always putting you first," David had admitted through the reinforced glass. "The war hero. The one who sacrificed for others while I just made money. I wanted to prove I was smarter, more successful. I never thought about who got hurt." Jake had left that visit with a heavy heart, but also with resolution. David's choices had cost lives, including the Marines who died in Afghanistan. Forgiveness might come eventually, but justice was more important than family loyalty. The afternoon brought the Foundation's weekly graduation ceremony, where veterans completed their training and officially became partners with their service dogs. Jake and Honor presided over the event, which had become a celebration not just of new partnerships, but of the possibility of healing after trauma. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake addressed the gathered crowd of veterans, families, and staff, "6 months ago, I thought my life was defined by what I'd lost. My arm, my daughter, my sense of purpose. Honor taught me that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something better." Honor sat beside him, his posture dignified despite his slight limp. The dog's amber eyes surveyed the crowd with calm intelligence, and Jake could see him cataloging each veteran, each family member, each person who might need his attention. As the ceremony concluded and the new partnerships were celebrated, Jake felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before Emily's death. The salvage yard that had once seemed like a burden had become a place of transformation. The dog he'd inherited as an unwanted responsibility had become his partner in healing. Honor nudged Jake's hand with his nose, a gentle reminder that the work was never finished, that there were always more veterans who needed help and more dogs who needed purpose. Jake scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling grateful for the lesson in loyalty that had saved both their lives. "Ready for the next mission, boy?" Jake asked. Honor's tail wagged once, confident and certain. They had found their way home. Sometimes life hands us burdens that feel impossible to bear. The loss of a child, the weight of disability, the betrayal of family we trusted. Jake Harrison thought his inheritance of a run-down salvage yard and an aging German shepherd was just another disappointment in a life filled with them. But Honor, that loyal dog, saw something Jake couldn't. Potential for healing, purpose beyond pain, and the truth that our greatest struggles often prepare us for our most meaningful work. When Jake lost his arm in Afghanistan and his daughter Emily in a car accident, he thought his story was over. Instead, it was just beginning. The Harrison Military Dog Training Foundation now helps hundreds of disabled veterans find hope through the unconditional love of rescue dogs, animals who, like their human partners, have survived trauma and learned to trust again. Jake's journey reminds us that inheritance isn't just about what others leave us, it's about what we choose to build from the pieces. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we're born into, but the one that chooses to stay when everything falls apart. Honor showed Jake that loyalty doesn't require words, it just requires showing up day after day with unwavering love. Discussion, questions. Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal's loyalty helped you through a difficult time? Share your story about the healing power of pets. Like Jake, have you found unexpected purpose or meaning after experiencing a major loss or setback in your life? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.